Good afternoon and welcome to AIP. My name is John Shabilsky and I'm Director of Financial Planning at Pastone, as well as a National Board Member and Treasurer of AIP. The focus of AIP is changing the world by inspiring and equipping professional advisors to impact philanthropy one gift at a time. We're nearly 2 years into our merger into AIP, and we're continuing the tradition we started over a dozen years ago when we created the Boston Philanthropic Advisors Roundtable to provide a place for education and networking among professionals who share an interest in philanthropy. For those of you who are not members, you can learn more about us at www.advisorsinphilanthropy.org. With this event, we're heading into our summer recess, but we will be back in the fall with new content. National webinars, as well as local meetings that I hope you'll be able to conduct in person. So check back with us in the fall, or if you're on our email distribution list, look for our emails for upcoming content. Today's program is on transformative strategies for scale and sustainability, developing philanthropic partnerships, whether through mergers or otherwise, as a means of gaining scale and positioning for the future. Our moderator is Melissa Sampson-McMorrow. Melissa chairs Nutter's Tax Department and co-chairs the Nonprofit and Social Impact Practice Group. She is also serving as co-chair of Nutter's COVID-19 Task Force. Melissa specializes in advising healthcare, higher education, cultural, and other charitable and nonprofit organizations and their affiliates on a wide range of issues related to tax exemption and nonprofit status. Melissa also regularly advises donors in developing and optimizing their charitable giving goals. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you very much, John and AIP, for hosting today's webinar. We have with us two panelists who could not be more passionate about this topic. So I am pleased to introduce to you Eric Curtis, President of Curtis Strategy, and Jean Phelps, CEO of LifeLinks Class. Just to pause it for a moment, this program was originally scheduled for March 16th when it all began. And we thought it was a very relevant topic at that time, and we only feel that it's even more relevant today. So thank you, Eric and Jean, for sharing your knowledge with us today. Very briefly, Eric, Curtis Strategy's mission is to advance organizations towards future viability by designing innovative strategy and sustainable business models. Curtis Strategy specializes in strategic planning, organization design, board development and governance, and merger strategy, much of which you'll hear about today. Jean, CEO of LifeLinks Class, is a veteran of considering scale and sustainability. Just a little bit on LifeLinks Class, which used to be two separate organizations. They provide services and supports to people who have an intellectual or developmental disability. Their founding families express a desire for all persons to experience a full life. This principle motivates them today to ensure that LifeLinks Class homes, day services, and community sports are innovative, personalized, and valued. And as I said, Jean has lived the consolidation experience, and we're thrilled that she's here today to share her insights, which are applicable to her sector, but also across the nonprofit sector. So I'm about to turn it over to you, Eric and Jean, but I just a little bit of a programming note, two programming notes. Number one, we will allot time at the end for listener questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the questions section, and we will take your questions to the best of our ability. And then if anyone is interested in switching their speaker presentation mode, if right now you are likely to be seeing everyone in the panelists, if you're interested in focusing more in on the speaker for a better viewing experience, you can just click on the Who's Talking button in up on the top of your screen and make that change. So Eric and Jean, over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Nutter for hosting the webinar, as well as AIP. for supporting us in this. And, thank you everybody for joining us. I think both Jean and I are really excited to share our experience and journey over the past few years. So just as Melissa had mentioned, the webinar will be kind of in two parts. The first, Jean and I will go through a presentation, and then we'll get right into answering some of your questions that you may have as the second half. So let me just jump in real quick here now. So again, we're going to dive into a little bit of background on health and human services and what's going on. Even though there's a significant amount of different types of nonprofit entities, there's quite a bit happening in the health and human services space. So I thought by just kind of starting with a macro view, which will lead into Jean's discussion on her experience with what her sector is in the merger between Lifelinks and CLASS. So right now, there's quite a bit happening with healthcare reform and accountable care organizations, and this has really shifted how funding has happened for the industry. And part of that was due to the advancements in technology affording the opportunity to conduct and handle business models a little differently. And what that means is that there's going to be a high reliance on technology going into the future, whether that be for person-centered planning, patient-centered planning, et cetera. And so the state is looking towards larger entities to be able to contract with. And the rumor out there is that sweet spot in size is going to be right around $40 million, because that's the size of the organization that's going to be able to afford the infrastructure that's going to be necessary in the future, whether that be technology and those types of resources. So right now there's over 6,000 human service organizations in Massachusetts. And if you think about the complexity of 6,000 organizations operating in the same sector, the same space, that's 6,000 agencies that the state has to deal with. That's 6,000 levels of fragmentation within the system. So when we look at trying to go towards a more integrative care model, that becomes very difficult to manage. Also, with the different systems, the alignment between capturing data and sharing that across multiple platforms becomes just that much more complex. Healthcare is forming these large healthcare systems, and I think what we'll start to see over the next 5 to 10 years is the formation of human service driven systems and that continuum of care. Because right now, the health and human services sector are experiencing significant competitive threats, not only from within and agencies either experiencing funding loss, but competitively bidding for RFPs that may go out on certain programs or services and things of that nature. A lot of these competitive threats are also coming from the for-profit world as health tech becomes more and more accelerated and starts to enter this space. We'll see things like a care.com, which has peer-to-peer technology application, or like-type organizations entering the space. In addition, we'll also see artificial intelligence creeping in to support decision-making, as well as just overall quality improvements. So all of these things, and especially the advancements in technology, are really accelerating the pace of consolidation. And over the past couple of years, there was a few mergers happening within the sector, but COVID-19 really strapped a rocket to the need to do this, and the need to consolidate, whether that was organizations experiencing funding cuts, or whether that was organizations realizing that they needed to have substantial size to afford some of the infrastructure that was going to let them play at a customized experience level, or at a level that allowed them to capture data and information. So I just want to switch it over to hand it over to Jean so she can talk a little bit about her experience in the human services world. So take it away, Jean.
So, hi, welcome. Glad to see you all. And thank you to Nutter and AIP for the invitation to finally do this presentation. I think what's important for us going forward is thinking about the three things that drove the merger that we engaged with Lifelinks and Class, but it's also continues to be relevant today. So we're going to try to, in this presentation, talk to you about what life was like pre-COVID, and here we are 14, 15 weeks later, and how the market and what we're doing is being shaped and influenced by the result of the coronavirus and where we find ourselves now. So back then, when we were thinking about, what made mergers, acquisitions, partnerships work for us, it was the financial reality, much of which Eric has already spoken to about in terms of the pressures in the market right now. But there's also a really important piece that's related to relationships, and that's the relationships between and among organizations, and searching for those relationships and building off of the partnerships that you might already have. And that was really important to us in the merger that we went through, and it's actually important to us now because, believe it or not, we're starting to think about doing some more. And that's the reality of where we find ourselves today. The other big piece was we thought we were looking at systems change, 6 months ago. The system that we are working in now has radically changed in 14 or 15 weeks and is still continuing to change. So to sort of better illustrate that for you, a little bit about the sector that Lifelinks Class plays in and the work that we did relative to the merger. As Melissa described, we work with predominantly individuals with an intellectual or developmental disability. In a nutshell, that means that the vast majority of people who we serve and support learn at a much slower pace, and that their cognitive abilities are limited by their intellectual or developmental disability. So our folks need lots of supports to get through their day, but our individuals have varying level of needs. So we have some people who have really high levels of personalized intensive care needs, and then we have some folks who are really quite capable and can function pretty well in society, and we try to run a service network that supports them throughout their life and across all levels of disability within intellectual and developmental disabilities. That does feel very narrow, and later on we'll talk about how we're thinking about changing and expanding the services that we're offering. The history of developmental disabilities in this country, and specifically in Massachusetts, large state-run institutions as recently as the mid-1970s with Fernald and Wrentham and Belchertown, large state-run institutions transitioned to a large network of community-based providers, of which Lifelinks and Class, and now Lifelinks Class, is one of those community-based providers, and the focus on individual services and supports is the underpinning of what we do. But it's important for you to understand that as an industry and as a field, our service network is relatively young, and we've gone through an awful lot of change in the last 40 or 50 years, and we're facing probably the most significant changes to come in our sector as a result of COVID-19. So we're living history as we're doing this presentation with you right now. Funding for us, there's a giant $1 billion budget for DDS services. That's the Department of Developmental Services in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It is the largest sector of the Executive Office of Health and Human Services after Mass Health. So it's a pretty sizable budget. Our rates of reimbursement and our dollars to support the work that we do for the vast majority of agencies in this space, we are getting our funding from the state. The state sets the reimbursement, monitors quality, brokers referrals, and access to services. So it's very much controlled by our funders, and providers who meet the need and go beyond with with really good, careful fiscal and programmatic management, people who can get creative with philanthropy to augment what the state doesn't provide, are the providers who seem to be do better in this space. So let me toss it back to Eric in terms of where we are with themes across all of the sectors of human services.
So we work with 4 main sectors in the nonprofit space: healthcare, higher ed, associations, which are your 501c6, as well as human services. And the themes that we're seeing across all of these sectors are identical. So we are seeing an advanced pace of market consolidation, meaning mergers and affiliations are really picking up, even in higher ed, which traditionally has not been the case. The level of organizations that are chasing advancements in technology are starting to realize that they need larger infrastructure and larger systems to play in a bigger, whether that's a geographical space or a more diversified space. And then looking at talent acquisition, before COVID-19, there was a workforce crisis, and I would say that's probably continuing, maybe not as extreme, into certain sectors with certain areas of focus. But there's also another thing happening with talent acquisition, and that's these organizations are in need of a different type of talent. So the actual skill sets needed to drive over the next 5 to 10 years are rapidly shifting towards technology. In fact, we ask a lot of our clients or suggest that you should consider becoming a technology company that has great service versus a service company with good technology, because everything is moving towards digitization and the ability to track information on people at a very detailed level, whether that's to improve the quality of their life or improve an outcome in which you serve. So these technology advancements are also changing business models. They're offering new ways of delivering service. As I had mentioned before, peer-to-peer technology solutions is something that is changing the game in human services, but there's also other things such as that the virtual space is creating that is shifting business models, whether you're in associations or higher ed or health and human services. And so the board of directors of a lot of nonprofits, whether they be 501c3s or 501c6, really need to be kept up to speed with a lot of these landscape changes, because they're accelerating and the pace of change is just ever increasing, and that pressure that leaders are experiencing is significant, and that really goes across the board as to whether an organization is small with a budget under $1 million, or whether they're large and they're 100 million plus. The timeliness of decision making across all organizations and all sectors is going to rapidly speed up, or the need of it to speed up. And so this discussion is really, and this is kind of a segue back over to Jean, but and her journey. But there's 3 main obstacles really to talk about when we're dealing with mergers in the nonprofit space, which may not be as applicable in the for-profit world. But when 2 organizations are coming together and they're merging, the 3 big issues and the 3 big barriers in a merger have been brand, board, and leadership. So when 2 organizations combine into one, there's 1 surviving brand, 1 surviving entity, 1 surviving board, and 1 surviving leadership team. So this creates a significant challenge in the nonprofit space, which has not been traditionally business driven, or in a position where they're making a lot of these tough decisions that would come along with workforce reduction or cuts or achieving some economies of scale. And so when we look at these obstacles, there is an opportunity with an affiliation model, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that circumvents these major obstacles. And I think it's worthy just to note that the majority, if not most of the mergers that we have done with nonprofits have had a CEO retiring on one side, which I think afforded the opportunity or the inroad to kind of get around that leadership issue. But what I'll do is I'll switch over. I'll have Jean talk a little bit about her journey with Lifelinks class.
So this is kind of the fun part for me, where I get to tell you what we had been working on for a couple of years before we sort of hit the wall that we'll call COVID-19. Two organizations, Lifelinks Class, both with long standing but slightly different histories in terms of services and supports to individuals with disabilities. But again, both organizations feeling that our core missions around defining what's possible for people with disabilities was the heart and soul. So in the beginning, you know, this organization, this merger started with a conversation between the former CEO of Class and myself over lunch one day. And that goes back to that original slide where I presented, where I talked about the relationship journey, and that you need to have those personal relationships in order to start this conversation. So he and I had lunch, and he basically said that he was concerned about the future of his organization, and he was staring down the barrel of retirement and was a little bit worried that his organization was smaller and maybe not as diverse, and might not be there. And I love this slide for you guys to kind of see. This is what these organizations do, and these are the people who we support, and these are the kinds of activities that happen. So we stood up two groups, one from each, representation from each organization. So board members and senior staff of both of the organizations came together to do the work of the merger. And some of it's pretty much pro forma in terms of what you would expect to do. But where we started in terms of beginning the work is we kind of took the two agencies and stood them up side by side and said, okay, so how do these two agencies compare? Lifelinks has a little bit longer and richer history and a more diverse service network. And we were founded as Lifelinks. Actually, we were founded as the Arc of Greater Lowell back in 1954. And Class was founded in 1976. Lifelinks, about a $17 million budget. Class, you can see this slide in terms of sort of where we stood up. Lot of crossover in some ways in terms of some of the services and supports, but the thing that you will note here is that there were a lot of places where we didn't cross over in terms of the kinds of service models. So Lifelinks had a particular expertise in supporting people in terms of residential and individual support services. Class had really developed an expertise in community-based and employment services, and that forensic CBDS, which means nothing to you all, is if CBDS stands for community-based day supports. And we, one of the neat things about Class is, and it's one of the things that we shared on the Lifelink side, is that we have a capacity to work with people who have a forensic history, who've been court involved, who may have an overarching connection to the legal system. Oftentimes it's around inappropriate sexual behavior in the community. Some of them are registered sex offenders, so there's a risk in that, inherent in that population, and both organizations had developed a capacity to work with those groups. So there were places where you could see we generally connected, and then there were other places where these two organizations coming together, you could see, would create a more rich and robust service network. So that was one of the things that was super important to us as we started. And then we sort of, the other thing that this group did is we really had to explore between the two organizations, why the hell do you want to do this? At that point in time, when we started this conversation now almost 3 years ago, Eric, because it's been a year since we merged, you know, we really needed to understand why we wanted to do this, and expanding services to families and to individuals, creating that one-stop shop where we could be able to provide the entire service array. We knew we were looking at decreased funding and increased regulations. It's the hallmark of human services right now, and that drumbeat continues to be banged on even throughout the period of COVID-19. So we knew that this was something that, you know, we were going to have to deal with. Improved asset utilization, improved quality and service delivery. These are just sort of some fundamental things that you hope that you're going to achieve as a result of doing your merger. Innovation and new service models. We obviously had some places where we were crossing over, and we had lots of energy and enthusiasm about creating some new services and supports. Savings from redundant functions. The first time we sat down, quick back of the envelope calculation, immediate $500,000 savings as a result of engaging in a merger, just eliminating redundancies within the two agencies. Expanding asset to staffing talent. Eric had spoke about the fact that, 3 years ago, it was really hard to recruit in our sector. It was really hard to find really skilled, capable individuals. We were going to have better buying power, and we were going to have better cachet in terms of trying to invite people to come in and work with us. And then geographic expansion with turnkey programs. We've now, got the ability to support people across the entire Merrimack Valley, Greater Lowell area, which is a pretty large geographic sector. So once we got the whys out of the way, then we had to kind of go through the process and figure out what we wanted to do. So I told you we had a steering committee that was made up of representatives of the two organizations. That committee would go back to the board, respectively, and seek agreement around what we needed to do and when we needed to do. We hired professional services, so both agencies had their own independent counsel, and then Melissa was the counsel for the deal, which was really important. So we had each agency had an independent voice, and then we had someone who was looking after the final product. So we stood up a letter of intent, confidentiality, and exclusivity agreements, which look very much the way that an M&A agreement process should look. And we stood up some terms with regard to what was going to be the surviving brand. And there's a funny story about it. We probably don't have time to tell you that way, but we thought that the surviving brand and the surviving entity initially was going to be Class, and it ended up actually being Lifelinks. And we've held on to both names in terms of the brand. The board, I think, again, because we spent so much time working together, we got over those board hurdles pretty easily. And the leadership piece sort of worked out because of the retirement of the previous CEO and the COO who had stepped into that role was willing to stay on in that role in the new larger merged entity. So we got past those questions fairly easy on in the process. A lot of time, a lot of energy, and a boatload of money was spent on due diligence, financial, human resources, legal, operational. We really needed to spend the time to get to know each other. I'm glad we did it. In hindsight, I probably wouldn't spend as much time doing that at the next go round, but it was a good learning experience and a good learning lesson for us for the first time out. Then talking to our funders, notification and engagement. As we said, all of our funding comes from the state. So our funders needed to be notified that the merger was happening. And they have to make assignments of the contract dollars that are associated with the individuals who we support. That was a little bit cumbersome. The state really wasn't ready for the merger process to the extent that we would have liked them to have been. I think we helped educate them through this process, and I think they're better prepared for this going forward. Governance, communication, and implementation plan. We had more plans than Carter's has little pills. That's a phrase that my father-in-law would use, God bless you. So here's the deal, it made sense to have lots of plans because the plans gave us the roadmap for where we wanted to go and when we wanted to get there. So we ticked off these boxes pretty well in terms of making sure we had those things in place. And then the definitive agreement, the deal closing, and the integration. Where this got hung up, because there were a few hang-ups, your banks, they like to weigh in on everything, and then they bring lawyers to the table, and their lawyers need to talk to our lawyers, and then our lawyers have to go talk to other lawyers. So that costs time and money, and they don't work on the same timetable that we do. That's abundantly clear. So in some ways it slowed down the process, but it was good because it was a learning lesson for us. So the lessons that are sort of the takeaway for us now that I get to reflect a year later in terms of how this worked. We did go really, really slow. It took us 2 years from start to finish, from the first conversation to actually signing the merger documents. That was important for us in terms of learning this process. I'm not sure now, given where we sit right now, that I want to take another 2 years to do the next merger or the next affiliation or the next partnership. I don't think we need to take that long, but at least we've got what we need to under our belt. Having the steering committee was huge and wonderful, and a huge support to both organizations to know that There was a group of people who were carrying the water around the merger process. Don't assume that your bank's going to be right with you on this. Don't assume that your funders are going to understand everything that you want them to understand on the timetable that you want them to understand it. And you have to be prepared to sort of take the lead and drive that. Retaining the best talent was, it was sort of a no-brainer because we really did have some really good folks sitting in the seats, but we did have to sort of tease out, well, who's going to finally sit in the role. So it did mean making some hard decisions around some people who needed to leave because there weren't two chairs. There was only one chair and there were two people, there were two incumbents. So that is a little bit of a hard process, but I can tell you that all of the people who left us as a result of the merger landed in really nice positions. So people had work. It's not like people got tossed out on their ear. Anticipate your workload to be 30% more than you thought it was going to be. And maybe even more, but that's sort of what it worked out to be. It definitely is a time suck in terms of getting it done, and the cost of the deal, which again we'll talk a little bit about further on down the road. But I think all in all, all in for both organizations, it cost us $300,000 to effect the merger. Now, granted, we saved a lot of money, but that was cash, $300,000 in legal and due diligence fees. So 1 year later, it's funny because when I thought about 1 year later, it was originally thinking about 1 year later in March, but now really 1 year later in June, because we were a year ago today, we were 1 week away from the deal being done. We are a full service agency. We do cover the entire Merrimack Valley and Greater Lowell area. Up until March 17th, we had a very, very strong budget. We're doing okay at this point in time, even in the time of COVID and the impacts of that. But there has been a gut punch as a result of what's happened. We definitely have much greater latitude and much more flexibility to meet the needs. We've got a really robust team of program level people who've been very responsive, and I think that's really been a wonderful plus. We've got some new residential models, and residential services continues to sort of be the heartbeat of the organization, and it's the thing that's continued to operate pretty much without any change during the time of the pandemic. But we've got some new programs coming online, and I think in the fall we'll have 2 new homes and another home online in the spring. So there's lots of growth on our residential side. We do have more resources, or we did have more resources for innovation. We definitely could use more, and this is a really critical point in time for us. There's a boatload of innovation that's happening within the organization. And even though back in March we were saying that we were positioned for partnerships and affiliations, the COVID-19 coronavirus process and the fallout from that has actually accelerated that. And we're actually in active conversations with a couple of entities around partnerships and affiliations. We're serving 800 individuals. We have 500 individuals, clinicians, and staff. That number is a moving target now because of some service design changes that are happening. 16 group homes, soon to be 19, and 3 locations where those day services operate out of Chelmsford, Lawrence, and Wilmington. So that's sort of in a nutshell what the merger process looked like for us. So Eric, you want to talk about the future? Because that's really clear.
Sure. So I think one thing that Jean realized as the organizations were merging is that, once the merger took effect, was to kind of bring everybody to the table, the new board, the new leadership teams, and conduct a strategic planning process, but a very thoughtful one. And the results of that were really around building an end destination for Lifelinks class as the gateway for fulfilling lifelong human service needs. And that really was, as there's a push towards value-based reimbursement, and there's a push towards giving individuals that need care more choice, and then the need to service a broader continuum of care, being that hub and that resource across a very diversified network of capability was just going to be that most critical end destination for the organization to achieve. And then the three things that would tie up into that was building an integrated human services network, and that really started looking internally. So as we mentioned, technology is moving at an unbelievable pace. And so shoring up the infrastructure of the operations so that they could have a solid technological foundation to bring new partners in, but shore up currently what they're doing, whether they had fragmented systems, whether they want to do person-centered planning, which would also be a leverage point in future discussions with other agencies. And then second was to positively impact the community and those being served. And this really gets down to the branding and the brand positioning. So LifeLink's class is undergoing a rebrand, which will be announced in the fall. As both organizations have come together, they've identified who they are, but are also putting together some strategies around thought leadership and using this rebrand, this new messaging, this thought leadership as a way of convening or inviting other providers into a larger network. And lastly, pursue collaborations, alliances, and partnerships. As we've already mentioned, the pace is really picking up, and so the need to partner and collaborate, whether those are mergers, affiliations, or shared services, or whatever they may be, is going to accelerate because there's going to be pressure on infrastructure and margins going forward. And so moving right from strategy, we wanted to just talk a little bit in this webinar about implementing the last one, which is around mergers and affiliations and how do we get there. And the title of this is Strategy for Scale and Strategic Growth. And I want to point out that a lot of these nonprofit associations or these nonprofit organizations have achieved a significant size. Some are 30 million, some are 200 million. And the organic growth strategy may no longer be viable for the size that these organizations have reached. And a lot of them have started to look towards this non-organic or this merger and acquisition so that they're not just getting small incremental growth, that they're achieving large scale to get the resources that they need to be relevant and sustainable in the future. And the affiliation model is affording a rapid growth strategy. So just real quick as a background, mergers, two organizations come together and there's one surviving entity. So you have to deal with brand, board, and leadership issues. Whereas in an affiliation, you are locked in together, and the healthcare system is known for using the affiliation model, but one organization maintains themselves as the parent or that sole member, and the other organization as the subsidiary. The benefit here is two legal entities, two 501c3s, two 501c6s, maintain their independence. They maintain their brand, their board, and their leadership. Certain things may change with regards to governance powers of the subsidiary, but the benefit of this affiliation model is to achieve those economies of scale through consolidation of back office operations, HR, finance, and IT. But the real benefit is that it affords the ability to move at a very rapid pace because you do not have to focus on integration in the short term. The integration strategy can come down the road, and a lot of healthcare systems will rapidly grow by adding hospitals in their system or other providers in their system. And now that this is kind of trickling over to the human services side, you're seeing this as a viable model for growth where that sole member, that parent organization can bring others very rapidly into the network and be able to use that as a rapid way to add value to smaller organizations, consolidate the market, and then over time, start to integrate key functions very strategically, very methodically. And in some cases, maybe even create a new parent corporation that it would be like a healthcare system, but for human services, that would oversee that entire network. So a lot of organizations are starting to look at affiliation strategy as a way of getting around brand, board, and leadership, and using this as a way to achieve rapid growth as part of their strategy. But one of the key factors in any merger, affiliation, or partnership is going to be having the resources to be able to achieve that. And that's where I'll kind of throw it back over to Jean to talk through philanthropic strategy.
Thanks, Eric. So I think the thing that is key, and that's this word cloud sort of gets to the heart of this, is that these words are really reflective of what happens in the health and human services industry, and where we are in terms of being mission-driven organizations. And that when we came to the table vis-a-vis our first merger, it was because what we wanted to do is we wanted to strengthen the mission of both organizations and create something that was better, richer, finer, and able to do more in terms of the depth and breadth of the organization. And that does line up really nicely with where philanthropy is at in terms of, hey, you want to be able to do more. The reality is that a merger is a really expensive undertaking, both in terms of time and talent and treasure. And we talked about all of this. It was 30% more work on top of running the organization. It really required a considerable amount of effort on the part of the leadership teams of both organizations, as well as members of the board of directors. And it cost a lot of money. It was about, so we ended up being a $30 million organization, and we spent $300,000 to become a $30 million organization. So it was a pretty significant and hefty lift. And the struggle that we had, or the challenges that we had, was figuring out how we were actually going to fund this merger, which actually we ended up just straight up funding out of cash. We sought opportunities for philanthropy to help us with this. And this is where I'm going to kind of put my hat on in terms of the beleaguered executive director of a nonprofit organization. We had a brilliant idea, which I still think could work, and I would love to see it work, of putting together a syndicate of like-minded individuals or organizations or foundations or anyone who felt that this was the worthy place to put some money, would be to help organizations get to scale through some additional resources coming to us to support the merger. And we had a number of entities who said, wow, that's a really good idea, but that's not how we give our money. Money basically, up until this point in time, was given for a particular program. There's not a lot of systems money out there for capacity building, and that's really what we need in order to get organizations from where they are now to where they want to be. It's the capacity that organization has to get there that's going to be the challenge. And it was one of the things that we really struggled with initially around, geez, should we even do this? Because it's going to cost a lot of money to get from point A to point B. But we were so enamored and we so strongly believed that the organization that we were going to create was going to be much more effective, much more efficient, that it made sense for us to spend this kind of money. So I think the thing that we're going to be looking for going forward is some impact giving organizations and foundations and donors who are willing to see beyond just, here's an individual program that's going to support kids with autism or adults who want to use technology in a different way, because those are the ways that we typically get funded, is you get money for specific programs. But instead, you want to see the impact of your dollars and sort of raising the entire organization up to a different level. And then you're going to really see the impact, because you're going to see those measures of efficiency and effectiveness. If there's anybody out there who wants to adopt an organization, this is the perfect time to do it, is when an organization is really trying to figure out, well, what should I be next? How do I get myself ready for the systems change that's coming? How am I going to make sure that the people who I serve today, who have a dependent, who who are dependent on me and have a societal need are still going to be able to get that need met in the future. So the future is here, and it came in some ways really quickly on the back of a little teeny tiny virus, and it's causing us to have to rethink who we are as an organization, what our conversation with philanthropic partners is going to be in the future going forward, and what the role of government should be in this, because one of the things that we're really struggling with right now is that government didn't have all the answers for us in this time of COVID-19. They still don't, and that we really do need to, that term public-private partnership, it's a little trite right now, but it's really super important. And I, for one, want to lead an organization that's going to be at the front end of those conversations. So, Eric, I don't know if you want to wrap up.
No, we appreciate everyone being in attendance, and we welcome the questions. If you want to enter any of your questions, either for Jean or myself or Melissa, into the questions sidebar, we can go ahead and answer those.
Yeah, thank you both. This is information packed, so I appreciate that. Information and insight packed. And we do have a few questions that have popped up, which I can I will start on. But I do want to stress one thing, and I really like how you brought it back to philanthropy, especially in an AIP program. And one of the things that I will say as as a participant in this process with organizations, I think that you can't underestimate the strain that this puts on the organization, and nonprofits to begin with are not are lean and don't have a whole lot of excess capacity in their human resources, and so that's one of the things that I always notice is that these executives, board members, staff work incredibly hard to get their organizations in a better place and to advance their mission. And so I don't want that to go unnoticed. And that's also, additional violent agreement on the capacity building piece of funding. But the first question we got, I think really is from both of you. So you've answered a couple of these. One is, how can funders help organizations surmount these barriers? Are there examples of how philanthropists have offered support to board and staff leaders as they consider how and whether to merge? And so you've given one example of the syndicate philanthropy. I know there have been funds out there, and I think there's probably a sense, would you agree, that there could be more?
Yeah, so Jean, I can start if that works for you. I think one of the challenges that we see is that the size of the giving related to the size of the expenses that mergers cost, there's a big gap there. A lot of agencies have typically seen, the $5,000 to $10,000 size grants when organizations are incurring $50,000 bills here, $75,000 bills here in relationship to the merger. And a lot of times that's just to get the merger done, right? That's to get it to the finish line with professional services and the due diligence process. That might not even, look at rebranding and the cost of rebranding, which, a lot of organizations are in desperate need of, and it may not look at other integration costs. As you move from being a 15 plus $15 million agency, now you come together and you're 30 or 50 or 75. The level of complexity has been amplified, and significantly so, that it puts a burden on all of the systems that a mom and pop mentality organization might have, or even a small organization, mid-sized organization might have, where maybe they now need to consider electronic health records, and those systems cost a lot. Or if they're of significant size, maybe they need to look at enterprise resource platforms and how they can unify the fragmentation of internal systems. So I think being able to look at how philanthropy identifies some of the challenges as a partner and bringing some of the expertise that you might have from even the for-profit side and understanding that landscape would make a significant difference. Venture philanthropy seems to be a big thing in how giving is transpiring, and I think that's just starting to materialize here and there, but I think there's a big opportunity to look at quite a few things. Jean, what do you think?
I think I'd only add a couple of other things. At one point in time, the Boston Foundation actually did have a fund that was specific around mergers and acquisitions in the nonprofit space. That I don't believe that no longer exists. I think that the other piece of this conversation is that there are a number of agencies out there that don't even know how to go about doing this. So if there was a way to structure some funding to even help organizations think through this in terms of this is how you would even begin to approach this, because there are a number of organizations I think that are just sort of stymied because they're so focused on their mission and what they need to accomplish that it's very hard to kind of pick your head up and look at what's going on in the rest of the world. And I do also want to echo what Eric said. I joked about the fact that we had plans for plans. We still do have a post-merger integration plan. So once you've signed the document, there's still a ton of work that needs to be done to bring two organizations together. And you have to think about things like the culture of the organization, and you do have to think about technology, because it's everything from your finance and accounting systems, your HR systems, your payroll platforms, your electronic health records. Those are all costs that we've, I said that it was $300,000 to sign the document. We have continued to experience some pretty hefty costs related to post-merger activities that are absolutely legit and reasonable. And we did need to look at things like, okay, so what should be the financial accounting software package that we should use? What's the best size package for the size organization that we have now? So those needs are ongoing, and there's, our funders don't fund you to buy a new software package. They don't. You got to find that money somewhere else. So there are ongoing costs. So you can kind of think about this funding in three phases. It's what do you need just to even think about, what kind of funding do you need just to even start the conversation about the merger or the acquisition or the partnership or the affiliation. Then it's the actual costs of doing it. And that's related to due diligence and all of the legal stuff. And then there's the costs of, well, now that you've combined as an organization, what are you going to need to be spending money on in order to get the best organization on the back end?
Thank you. Okay, you are right on point, both of you. Another question was how much do these cost? And you've mentioned the $300,000. Is that outlays? Is that $300,000 of outlay, or are you including staff time dedicated, that 30% staff time that you mentioned?
When I did the back of the envelope calculation, I did include staff time in that, because it's time that was above and beyond what you would normally spend on program operations or agency management. Yeah.
So it's hard costs and I don't know if I'd call them indirect, but time is money. And so here's another question, a little bit of a different topic. How can advisors encourage board members at organizations that are thinking of merging to put mission first, and as of course the people that they serve, over their individual role as board members? So, right, when you have a for-profit deal, the thing that's negotiated about most often the thing that's most highly negotiated is the purchase price, and very often there's not a purchase price in the nonprofit world, and I think sometimes the most difficult situations may be governance, and so I think that's maybe where the question is going.
I mean, I think there's so much emotion tied up in these nonprofit organizations. In some cases, the smaller ones will have family members served at the organization and you know, or have been on the board for a long time. And it's that balance of mission and money. But some organizations are more towards one end of the pendulum or another versus kind of being right in the center. And I think that, you know, in my experience, that one of the reasons that we say to go slow to go fast is that the board needs to be taken through a journey to understand the total landscape shift that's happening. And in some cases, nonprofits are going to be going out of business. In other cases, that creates a lot of opportunity for larger entities like Lifelinks Class or some of the other ones that are out there to step in and play a value-added partner role before they do that. And so, you know, when you look at the mission of an organization, the trends are pushing towards more broad-based. This is just my opinion of what we're seeing, more broad-based missions that are very diversified within the sectors that they play in. And I would account that, you know, I would say that's due to a lot of what's going on with technology, is the competitive landscape is really heating up and it's driving that. But again, a lot of the boards don't see that. And so either keeping them up to speed on that or walking through a very methodical process that will allow them to digest major decisions in a timely manner, whether that be around brand, board, or leadership, or just kind of, you know, the concept of merging or affiliating in general.
I think the other thing is that, you know, we are going to look for partners who have a strategic plan that aligns with our strategic plan. You know, if there's an organization out there that, you know, just basically wants to sort of live in its own little space and continue to support the individuals that they've historically supported in the ways that they've historically supported, that organization's probably not going to be ripe for entering into a network where you're going to be partnered with a whole bunch of other organizations who do a lot of, you know, varied and different things. So again, that comes back to, you know, having that relationship and kind of knowing who your partner is. And I think that's really, really critical, because the board of that organization were the writers of that strategic plan, basically. So if strategically the organization isn't aligned with you in terms of where you want to be going, in terms of what you want to achieve as part of the merger, I would say neither entity should waste their time. You have to make sure that you're sort of aligned in terms of not only your mission, because again, most human service agencies who work in our space, our missions are very similar. It's what's the strategy behind that mission, and if those strategies aren't aligned, it's not worth the effort.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. We're exactly at our time. Very well done. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your information and insight. Eric and Jean's contact information is on the screen below. We will be distributing a recording of this to attendees so that you can have that contact information. I'm assuming it's okay if people want to reach out.
Yep.
So feel free to do that. And just in closing, thank you so much to both of you. And given that Jean mentioned state funding, I'm just going to mention a couple of other educational or informational opportunities this week. And you can look at the Nutter website with Senator Michael Rodriguez, the Senate Ways and Means Committee Chair, talking about the Massachusetts budget. So if that is of interest to any of you on the call, I encourage you to look there, as well as payroll protection plan developments as well this week. So thank you to both of you. Thank you to AIP, and we hope everyone has a nice evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. It was wonderful.